Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow. I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to have to come back. This is, or maybe I should just quit right here. Precious, thank you for that wonderful introduction. The first thing I want to say is, Mom, she's doing an awesome job. And I saw a photo of you in Fulton County, Georgia, outside the courthouse when Rudy Giuliani was being ushered in. And I admire your moxie. Please give my regards to the District Attorney of Fulton County. She's doing an incredible job. Really, such a treat to be with all of you, and thank you for coming out. I thought I would just make a couple brief remarks and then really look forward to our conversation. I thought on January 6th, a year and a half ago, well, let me start out. I was on the House floor that day. The Speaker had asked a small group of us to lead the opposition to the effort to decertify the election. And so I was speaking, I was listening to what the Republicans were saying, I was trying to figure out how I was going to rebut the arguments they were making, and I really wasn't paying attention to what was going on the Mall. And the first time I knew that something was wrong is I looked up from my notes and the Speaker was no longer in her chair. And I knew that she had intended to preside come hell or high water, so it was very striking to me that suddenly she wasn't there. And two Capitol Police came back on the floor almost immediately thereafter and grabbed hold of our number 2, Steny Hoyer, and whisked him off the floor so quickly I remember thinking to myself, I've never seen Steny move that fast. And then they came back with a succession of more serious announcements that there were rioters in the building, that they were unable to put down or expel the rioters, that we needed to get out our gas masks, which I didn't even know we had, but apparently they were under the seats. We needed to be prepared to get down on the ground, and then ultimately we needed to get out. And I waited for the throng at the doors to get out to thin, and so I was standing back, and you could hear the insurrectionists now outside the chamber, to the point where they were banging on doors and breaking glass. And a couple of Republicans came up to me and said, you can't let them see you. And the other one said, I know these people, I can talk to these people, I can talk my way through these people. You're in a whole different category. And my first reaction was to be kind of touched by their evident concern for my safety. But my next reaction was, if you sons of bitches hadn't been lying about the election, I wouldn't need to worry about my safety. None of us would. But what stands out to me most about that day, and then the days that followed, is when we came back later on, late that evening, early into the morning to finish the job, when the police had bravely expelled these insurrectionists, the Republicans picked up right where they left off, still trying to overturn the election. And even so, in the days that followed, I thought, surely now that the country has seen the terrible end to which Trump and Trumpism have brought us, surely now they will repudiate the big lie and everything that went with it. But of course that hasn't happened. Instead, they have held on even more dearly to that big lie, as we saw in Wyoming, sadly, with Liz Cheney's defeat. And they've used that big lie to usher in a new generation of Jim Crow laws meant to disenfranchise people, particularly people of color. They've used it to run local, meritocratic, technocratic elections officials out of town, sometimes with death threats. And they've used it to attack the infrastructure of our elections in ways designed to make it easier to overturn the next election should they lose that as well. And so we find ourselves a year and a half after the events of that day, and our democracy is more vulnerable than it was on January 6th. The book that I am here to talk about is entitled Midnight in Washington, and I chose that title in part because it was kind of the theme of a speech I gave during the closing argument in the first impeachment, but also because midnight is the darkest hour of the day everywhere in the world. And while it's a dark time, it's also a hopeful time, because you know that what follows is filled with the prospect of light. I have to say, though, now a year and a half later, after writing this book, maybe the title should have been 11:30 p.m. Because we weren't at midnight. It's still darker now than it was then. But I do want to say before we begin the discussion, I have every confidence we're going to get through this. I think when you're in crisis, and we're in crisis as a country, it's hard to see how it ends. Sometimes it's difficult to even see if it will end. But this too shall pass. We will get through this. But what we do in this moment will determine how quickly we get through it and how much damage we have to suffer along the way. And the way we get through this quicker is by being engaged. And so I'm just so grateful to you that you're here. I'm grateful to Manny's because this is the convening spot of all convening spots. And Precious, thank you for all your wonderful work in organizing these fabulous programs. And it's a delight to join you, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
All right. And Angelina, our event manager, always reminding us to keep the mics close. So, Congressman, I mentioned before we opened the doors that this is a hard read. It's incredibly thoughtful, detailed, and I found myself picking it up repeatedly. And when you would talk about your colleagues or talk about the various hearings or those quiet moments or just the offhanded moments, it took me right back to a point I didn't realize the amount of trauma the weight of that time had. And I'm here in the lovely confines of the Bay Area. So my first question is, this book, was this something that, as everything was swirling around you, you said, I got to write this? Was it something where when that particular term, you're like, I'm going to write a book? Or was it a compulsion? Like, what was it even like? And then to recount, walk us through that.
Well, thank you for the question. I would be on the House floor, it seemed like innumerable times, and my colleagues would come up to me and say some variation of the same thing, which was, you better be writing this down. Please tell me you're writing this down. You're at the center of an historic time, and you need to be writing this down. And I would always respond in the same way by saying, when do I possibly have time to write any of this down? And then the pandemic hit. And suddenly we were all, sequestered away in our homes. And I thought to myself, if I'm ever going to write it down, this is the time for me to write it down. I have to say it was a mixed experience writing it down. Some parts of it were really fun to write, and I really enjoyed. Most of the first section of the book is biographical. It's about my family and my upbringing and our family's immigrant roots, and that was really wonderful to write. There were other times that were torturous for me to write. The hardest part of the book for me to write was there's a scene in the book where I'm at Amoeba Records in Los Angeles. Anybody here been to Amoeba Records? And I'm there with my daughter and her boyfriend, and my phone starts blowing up. Bill Barr has just released his false summary of the Mueller report. And I told my daughter and Eric, you go inside, I will meet you inside. Of course, I never made it inside. What followed that moment was 6 or 7 weeks when Bill Barr withheld from the country the Mueller report so that he could lie about it. His summary was patently false, but of course at the time he released the summary, none of us had access to the report except Mueller. And unbeknownst to the rest of us, Mueller's team was apoplectic about how badly Barr had misrepresented the report. But the result was I was just being pilloried in conservative media, and I had no way to defend myself. I couldn't point to the report. I couldn't point out how fallacious this summary was, and I felt like I was just twisting in the wind. And writing about that, and my process in writing was to put myself back in the time. I would watch the interviews I did at the time. I would read the articles about what was happening at the time. And so I found it really quite useful, because I could watch an interview and I would recall when I watched it, oh yes, I remember being asked that question, and at that time I could tell the audience this, but I could not tell the audience about that because it wasn't public yet. And so parts of it were really quite hard to write. The most fun part, though, was frankly doing the audiobook, because I used to love reading to my kids. I used to try to read to my wife, but she doesn't like being read to. And so this was my first time to read to people again, and it was a joy.
Okay, that was cute. So earlier I mentioned, half jokingly, about you being a fan of the Raiders. You're really a fan of the Raiders, even though they're in Vegas now.
Yes, I've been with them from Oakland to LA to back to Oakland, and I will be with them until I'm no longer around.
So the reason I bring that up, one, I live in Oakland.
When you look at me, most people think he's definitely Raider Nation. I kind of radiate Raider Nation.
No, that's cute. I just don't see you with the black and silver face paint, on the BART train or, in the parking lot. It's interesting. Beautiful community. But the reason I brought that up was really to talk about Devin Nunes. I know, y'all didn't expect that pivot. Hold on. No booing here. We are a supportive container for conversation. So in the book, and I will let you guys know, as you all have seen, it's a big book. There's a lot, so many topics. We're not going to cover everything, but I know everyone has a copy and you're going to read and you're going to have all these questions. One of the things that really struck me, though, in reading were the different personalities. And so you'll see where this is going. So you talk about Devin Nunes, no booing, and how you all had a rapport, dare I say, a friendship, certainly an acquaintanceship, in large part because you two were Raiders fans. And I mean, the detail of talking about you all exchanging text messages about the new quarterback or plays, that, those small details really bring home a closeness and dynamic. And you describe him when you first met him and started working with him as kind of in the range of a country club Republican like John Boehner without the tan, which that conversation's for another day. And in going through the book and seeing the photo of your grandfather, Harry, I wondered if maybe your grandfather would be like, okay, that guy's all right. Can you pinpoint a time when you realized, oh, Raider Nation, no more? When he took this turn, and what was it like to have that?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the reasons I wrote the book is that there had been a lot written about what went on in the Trump White House during those years, but at the point I wrote the book, not much written about what was going on in the Congress. And the reality is that without the enablers in Congress, Donald Trump could never have done any of what he did. He could not have torn down our institutions. He couldn't have had Republican Party conventions on White House grounds. He couldn't have stonewalled all the subpoenas. He was only able to do that because the Republicans in Congress went along with him. And I wanted to write about how does that happen? How do people that I had respected, because I believed that they believed what they were saying, come to sacrifice their ideology, their beliefs, their views, their very morality in the service of such a deeply flawed human being? And of course, each of the stories of the individuals is different. In the case of Devin Nunes, he was a very pragmatic, non-ideological Republican. In fact, during the Tea Party revolution, I remember him describing the Tea Party as lemmings in suicide vests. And we did have a very good rapport. He was the chair of the Intel Committee. I was the ranking member of the Intel Committee. And we worked together well. We worked together on a bipartisan basis. What changed for Devin Nunes was very dramatic. When it became clear after the 2016 election that the Russians had interfered in our election in an effort to help Trump get elected, and there were innumerable unexplained contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians, it fell to our committee to do the investigation. And at that time, he was the chair of the committee. Much of the Russia investigation was conducted while the Republicans were in the majority. I was the ranking Democrat, and my only real power as the minority ranking Democrat was to use the public platform to compel our committee to do the investigation that we should have done. But it was ultimately his decision whether a subpoena went out or it didn't go out, whether a witness came in or didn't come in. And he had gotten to know Trump during the presidential campaign when Trump did a swing through the Central Valley. Trump then, when he was president-elect, put Nunes on the transition team. So Nunes was helping to pick people like Mike Flynn, great choice. And that was kind of a heady thing, you know, to be consulted by the incoming president on who cabinet pick should be. Well, when it fell to our committee to do the investigation, he wanted to retain that seat at Trump's table. But at the same time, he was charged with trying to do an investigation of Trump. That would have been a difficult thing for anyone to do, but it was impossible for him to do. And where it all fell apart was after our first open hearing, in which James Comey was one of the witnesses. And James Comey revealed for the first time publicly that not only had there been an investigation into Hillary's emails that he had talked about quite openly, but there was a secret investigation that was never disclosed into the Trump campaign and its ties to Russia. And, you know, besides the shockingly double standard nature of that, when Comey first revealed that during our hearing, it set off an explosion in the White House. And I'm sure that Donald Trump came down on Devin Nunes like a ton of bricks. Because what followed the next day was an episode called the Midnight Run, where Nunes went off to an undisclosed location and then did a press conference saying he had seen documents that showed an Obama-era conspiracy to surveil the Trump campaign, etc. And very soon after this stunt, it was revealed that the secret location, the ostensible whistleblower, the secret location he'd gone to get these documents was the White House itself. So when he went to present these documents to the White House that he'd gotten from the White House, it was clear he had just laundered the documents. And what's more, the documents didn't show anything along the lines that he said. When that blew up, it was such an utter humiliation. At that time, this was weeks into the Trump administration, even the Republicans walked away from him, wouldn't defend him. But MAGA world did. And it was such a crucible that he was in, such a fishbowl, that I think it forged like a drowning man in a life raft, a bond that has lasted to this day. Now with others, I promise my other answers will be shorter. With others, the calculus was very different and far less complicated. Robert Caro, the historian, and I talk a lot about him in the book, once said in an interview that power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it says a lot about who we are. Power said a lot about who Liz Cheney is. It turns out she's a person of considerable courage and conviction. It has said a lot about Elise Stefanik, who is the exact opposite. When Liz Cheney said, "I won't tell that big lie if it costs me my position," Elise Stefanik put her up hand and said, "Pick me." And I had a number of terrible epiphanies during these years, but one of them was that so many of the people I worked with cared about nothing but the maintenance of their own office, or maybe getting a better job in the future. And I had thought much more highly of my colleagues than I came to believe when I saw what they were truly made of.
And that actually dovetails very nicely with my next question. So obviously, living here in the Bay, pretty much every time a Californian is mentioned, it really resonated. And please do not boo, guys. This is recorded on the Zoom, and my mom is watching. But I want to talk a little bit about Kevin McCarthy. You mentioned that you weren't really familiar with him. Like, there's the distance, and you basically learned all you needed to know after a flight and some of the ensuing fallout. So, tell us, those who haven't read the book, a little bit about that encounter. Talking about power revealing, it was stunning to me. And what does this say about the GOP today to you?
Well, first of all, how does your mother feel about profanity?
She's fine
Okay.
because she's married to my dad.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first time I had a conversation of any length with Kevin McCarthy was in 2010, when we were just coincidentally seated next to each other on a United flight back to Washington. And his district is probably 100 miles from mine. We don't sit on the same committees, so we never really had an opportunity to interact. And we're sitting on the plane. We're making the kind of small talk you make when you're waiting for the movie to start, any movie. And in this case, it was about the midterms and who was going to win the midterms. And I said Democrats were going to win the midterms, and he said Republicans were going to win the midterms. It was a total nothing burger of a conversation, and I thought nothing of it. Until we land in Washington, we go our separate ways, and unbeknownst to me, he goes off and does a briefing for the press. And at that point, I think he was like a deputy assistant whip or something in the Republican conference. And he tells the press, Republicans are definitely going to win the midterms. Everybody knows it. He just got off a plane with Adam Schiff, and even Adam Schiff said Democrats were going to win the midterms. Now, this was largely in the pre-social media era still. So I didn't learn about this until the next morning when it came out in one of the Hill papers. And I was beside myself. And I rushed up to him on the House floor that morning, and I said, Kevin, first of all, if we're having a private conversation, I would have thought it was a private conversation. But if it wasn't, you know I said the exact opposite of what you told the press. And he looks at me and he says, yeah, I know, Adam, but you know how it goes. And I said, no, Kevin, I don't know how it goes. You just make shit up and that's how you operate? Because that's not how I operate. But that is how he operates. And in that sense, he was really made for a time like this, when the truth is for suckers. You say what you need to do to gain power, you do what you need to do, and nothing else matters. If you needed any further proof of it, you'll remember the scandal of, probably, 3 months ago, so it's like really old news by now, when Kevin McCarthy was scandalously caught lying about telling the truth. Do you remember this? Yeah. He was asked by the New York Times whether he told his colleagues at the time of the insurrection that he thought Trump should resign. Oh, I never said anything of the kind. He was adamant. There goes the fake news again. Well, then the New York Times plays the recording of him saying exactly that. And the scandal wasn't that Kevin McCarthy had to lie or was lying. That was no surprise to most of us. The scandal was that telling the truth was the disqualifier. And I think of all the corrosive things that Donald Trump did during those 4 years, none may have been ultimately as destructive as the relentless assault on the truth, and the idea that somehow we're entitled to our own alternate facts. If we can't agree upon a shared experience of some kind, a democracy doesn't function. If there's no truth anymore, then how do you decide except by following along tribe or party? This is part of the reason why Donald Trump calls everyone a liar. Because if everyone is a liar, then, well, you might as well be with
Recording
him
in
because he's your
progress.
liar. And so I can't say that McCarthy really changed. I think he's always been the same person he's been, but it is one of the reasons why I think he has such an affinity with Donald Trump.
I think we all need to take a moment.
You know, I do want to, and maybe you're going to bring this up. There are the stories of a lot of the heroes of the time too in the book, and the heroes like Alexander Vindman and Fiona Hill and Bill Taylor, and those are the people that got me through this time, who were just so inspiring. And what was so interesting to me about many of them, like Fiona Hill, like Marie Ivanovich, like Alexander Vindman, is they were immigrants. And they came to this country and understood so much better what this country was all about than a lot of other people like Donald Trump who were born here. I remember being in a bookstore 3 or 4 years ago and meeting a man from Senegal, and he had a medical board guide, study guide. He had been a physician in Senegal. And he told me how heartbreaking it was for him to see what the President of the United States was doing and saying. And I remember listening to this man who had been in the country for only a matter of months, but had dreamed his whole life of being here, and thought to myself, this man who's been in the country only for a few months understands what this country is about better than the President of the United States.
Wow. I was going to ask you about Lindsey Graham, but that's not that. He's problematic on a host of levels. What does that encounter? Like, what does that say to you about just the state of where we are? The state, I mean, whether or not the country was built on a two-party system, this is how we have operated historically. And what you and your colleagues and smarter people than all of us are telling us is that we have one party that's still in the game, is still understanding again the foundations of this great American experiment, and we have another party that, whether it's naked ambition, bullying, just sycophantic fealty, they have tossed in the towel, but they're refusing to leave the stage. I mean, what do you think of that? Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. It is a terrible tragedy that at the moment only one of America's great political parties is wedded to our democracy. The other has become kind of an anti-democratic, anti-truth cult of the former president. And as we saw in Wyoming, again, speaking truthfully about something as basic as an election is disqualifying in the Republican Party. As long as that's the case, as long as they're not wedded to our democracy, they're just going to have to be beaten at the polls. There's no accommodating them. There's no trying to get to yes with them when they're not devoted to our democracy. There were a lot of canaries in the coal mine before the present predicament. In 2016, when a Democrat won the governorship in North Carolina, for example, Republicans in the North Carolina legislature responded not by saying we'll do better next time, not by saying we'll change our policies or maybe get a better message. No, they decided they would strip the governor of his responsibilities. That told us something was changing in the body politic of the Republican Party, where it wasn't wedded to our democracy anymore. It was wedded to holding on or getting power by any means and changing the nature of the rules if you lose. I like to say to Liz Cheney, I look forward to the day when I can go back to fighting with you. But at the moment, any Republicans who are devoted to our democracy, we need to make common cause with. I think that there are a couple global forces that are responsible for our present circumstance that predate Trump. They'll be here when he's gone, and we're going to have to address them to preserve our democracy. And the first is what I was mentioning when I talked about truth, and that is we now get our information from such different places, which makes it very hard to communicate with each other. I will step off the train in New York, and the first person will come up to me and say, "Are you Adam Schiff? You're my hero. I just want to shake your hand." And the next person standing right next to them will say, well, you're not my hero. You lie all the time. Why do you lie all the time? And I will look at them and I'll say, I know what you're watching, and I know what you're watching. And it's not the same thing because I'm the same person, and I can't be both, right? I remember a guy coming up to me in the airport in New Jersey, and he starts laying into me. You should be ashamed of yourself. Your family should be ashamed of you. I think they are ashamed of you. I think you know they're ashamed of you. And he's going on and on, and I don't really engage with someone like that. There's not much profit to be had in doing so. So I let him rail on for a while, and he went away, and then he came back. And he starts in on me again. I'm like, dude, you made your point the first time. And he's going on, and I'm like, you got to stop watching so much Fox. And he's going on and on. I'm like, just change the channel, man. Just change the channel. You can do it. You can do it. There's a whole other world out there. And so I get on the plane. It's a small plane, like 2 seats on either side of the aisle. I don't even know what plane he's on. He just ran into me in the airport. And then I'm seated near the back. I see him get on the plane. I'm like, oh, God. And he's walking down the aisle. He's walking down. Like, holy shit, he's going to be sitting right next to me. Turns out he's sitting right in front of me. And he turns around and he says, I got to say, I'm kind of impressed to find you here in Coach. And I said, I'm kind of surprised to find you here in Coach because you seem like a real first-class kind of guy. And anyway, he asked the flight attendant for crudities. But he didn't, but it seemed like a timely reference. But so I think this revolution in how we get our information, and in particular now that we get it from social media, that knows all of our likes and dislikes, our shares and not shares, is part of where we are. A viral world in which lies travel far faster than truths. But the other big global force is the changing nature of our economy, in which millions and millions of people at home and abroad who are in the middle class are desperately worried about falling out, and millions of others are worried they'll never make it into the middle class. And at the same time, they turn on the television and they see the titans of industry literally blasting off into space. And they think this is rigged. They look at the guy on TV going to space and they say, I work just as hard as he does. And many of them do. And they think the system is stacked against them. And along comes this demagogue to say, I alone can fix it. And also, your present circumstance are because of those other people who don't look like you. I think as long as there is that kind of economic anxiety and inequality, it's going to be ripe for a despot. And it's part of the reason why we've had this autocratic strain within the GOP here, but we're seeing movements towards autocracy in Hungary and in Poland and Brazil and the Philippines, and we're going to have to figure this out. President Biden is exactly right when he makes the connection between the economic agenda and the democracy agenda, because at the end of the day, if a democracy doesn't deliver, people are going to start looking for other alternatives.
So I'm glad you brought up President Biden. Actually, what's really funny, this is going to tie into the question that my mother asked, which is hilarious.
I'm kind of scared of your mom, to be honest.
She's Mabel. She's lovely. So, when we talk, I've grown up my mother's an immigrant too, so very much like the Senegalese gentleman, she knows the story of this country. She is Liberian, and Liberia's history is directly tied to this country, and it is, she's feisty, but I also know that it hurts her, and it hurts, my father and that side of the family, who are the descendants of slaves. Like, we put in some work to be a part of a great country, and to see it seem to fall apart so easily is disheartening. But you mentioned President Biden, and then earlier you also were very feisty, saying, there's no talking. We just got to vote him out. And my mom's question and concern is, it still feels like a lot of Democratic leadership, rightly or wrongly, was caught flat-footed in 2016 and was like, no, we can work this out. They're reasonable people, and are still keeping some of that same energy despite so much evidence to the contrary. So what should we be doing? What should President Biden be saying and pushing for? Why are we still seemingly on the right side of so many issues, but unable to really gain a foothold? What are your thoughts?
Let me start where you began, because I think a lot of Americans now are deeply worried about the future of the country and what they've seen, and in despair. And we just don't have the luxury of despair. When I'm tempted to be discouraged, I think of John Lewis. John Lewis, up until the day he died, was an irrepressibly optimistic person about the country. I don't think I ever saw John Lewis go through a day without smiling. And he always urged us to get into good trouble. And I had to think to myself, if John Lewis can have lived the experience that he'd lived and still be optimistic about the future of the country, then I have to be optimistic about the country. And so we know what we have to do. And we have the power and we have the numbers to turn this country in the right direction. Now, in terms of what the president is doing and should do, let me just say that, and I myself, even though I live, eat, and breathe this stuff, didn't fully appreciate until we passed the bill last week that made the most massive investment in attacking climate change in our history, that after decades of trying, we finally get to have the government negotiate drug prices to bring drug prices down. There's so much of importance in that bill, but not until that bill passed did I really look back and say, we did that. We did a massive infrastructure bill. We did a CHIPS Act to invest in science and bringing manufacturing back to the United States. We did a rescue plan that saved restaurants and other small businesses, that got vaccinations in people's arms and saved lives. We did all this in a year and a half when the Senate was 50-50 and we had a 4 or 5 or 6 seat margin in the House. That is going to go down in history as one of the most productive sessions of Congress ever. And I have to say, and tip my hat to one of your local politicians, Nancy Pelosi, because with the margins we had in the House and Senate, there is no way anyone else could have accomplished that except for her. She's the most talented, incredible person I've ever met. And when I got to Congress, I used to kind of bemoan that I got there too late to serve with the great Tip O'Neill. And then I got to see Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, and I'm like, okay, the people that come after me, they're going to feel bad they didn't get to serve with the great Nancy Pelosi. But Joe Biden has a lot to crow about. This was all done with his leadership and under his watch. And the only thing, and I talked to one of his top aides a couple of months ago, the only thing I would advise the White House, and this is what I told this top person, I said, I would have you take one page and one page only out of Trump's book. And that is, Trump was endlessly self-promotional. Yes. Yeah. Now, in Trump's case, it was all bullshit. But here, you've got an incredible story to tell. But it doesn't tell itself. And one thing we learned from the Affordable Care Act, which was an amazing accomplishment that brought health care to tens of millions of people who didn't have it, is nothing sells itself, no matter how good it is, particularly when it's being savaged by the other side. And so I think the president needs to be out there every day, multiple times a day, reminding people what he's done. And we in Congress need to be amplifying what he's done. He has the most powerful megaphone there is. And we need to be out broadcast even further, because it's a remarkable set of achievements and I think we're starting to see the public appreciation for that. About 2 months ago, the generic polling, meaning when you ask people, do you want the Democrats to control Congress or the Republicans, was pretty hard against us. We were down by about 6 to 8 points. 6 to 8 points may not sound like much, but in reality, 6 to 8 points means often like 2 dozen, 3 dozen seats in Congress. Now, after the decision came down, striking down Roe v. Wade, that began to change, and to the point where today it is basically parity. We may have a 1-point advantage in the generic. To have the party in power in the White House be at par during the first midterm is very unusual, and it's a very positive sign for us. Now, I still think we've got a hard road, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. But we can win this midterm, and God help us if we don't. If Kevin McCarthy had been Speaker in 2020, he would have overturned the election. There is something worse than Donald Trump running again and winning, and that is him running and losing and them succeeding in overturning the election. So the good news is we're doing much better now, because I think part of that Roe decision not only told people what they were willing to do to women's reproductive health, but also showed the country just how radically reactionary their agenda really is. And when you couple the awakening to the radical nature of their agenda, on the one hand of the ledger, and on the other hand, the extraordinary set of accomplishments by Democrats, we've got a powerful case to make.
Excellent. That's a great answer. So I just have a couple more questions. We want to have some time for audience questions and then the book signing, of course. In reading about you generally, and then, of course, in the book, I think it's fair to say that you have critics on all sides. Obviously, the whole GOP machinery, they had lots of issues, but they are who they are. But there's also, to my mind, amongst those of us who are left of center, my sense is that sometimes it's not the same. I'm not doing both sides or equivalency, but there's still a challenge in terms of sort of the extreme view of things, like the extreme ideology. I joke with the team about how, particularly here in San Francisco politics, and you all know what I'm talking about, there are people, we're all on the same side, but there are some who are so focused on the argument or the case study that's great in a classroom, but not the real world, and yet they can't get out of the classroom. What are your thoughts on that? And do you feel that with these recent wins, those who have this ideal, which many of us support, can all come together with those who maybe are more pragmatic, so that ultimately we are able to make the impact and the change that we all ultimately want?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. First is we are, and I think proudly, a big tent party. We're either going to be a big tent party in the majority or we're going to be a small tent party in the minority. We need all of our members representing the whole range of political viewpoints to be pulling in the same direction. And we can't win unless we have some of our most progressive members out exciting our base, and in particular young people. If young people aren't excited to turn out and vote, we lose. If they are excited to turn out, they can change the world. At the same time, without some of our moderate members in these difficult districts, and I was just in Iowa campaigning for colleagues in 3 different districts, and in Illinois and in Michigan, without the Alyssa Slotkins and the Abigail Spanbergers and the Elaine Lurias, we can't be in the majority either. It takes all of us. And, look, I look at the other side, they're not even committed to our democracy. There is a wide chasm between where we are and where they are, no matter where we are within the Democratic Party. And so we cannot afford to be fighting with ourselves when the house is burning down around us. And I have great respect for all my colleagues. I recognize that their districts are not like mine. They're not that lucky. What can I say? And so I show them respect because they deserve it, and we need them. And look, I am just so exhausted with the endless stream of mass shootings in this country. And the bill that we passed was historic only in the sense that we actually passed the bill. But in terms of how far it goes, it doesn't go anywhere near where I want it to go. Now, I wasn't going to vote against it because it wasn't everything I wanted. But I'm not at all and never will be content with that being the end of the story. So my view is you fight for as much as you get, you take the win, and you live to fight another day and come back and get more.
Awesome. All right. Yes, a round of applause. And everyone, I owe you all an apology. I miscalculated our time. I thought we had you a little bit longer, but you have a hard out. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take audience questions.
Can I make a suggestion? I have until 6:15. As long as those of you that would like me to sign your book, just let me sign it without asking me questions. I think we can take a couple audience questions. Does that work for you all? Okay,
Are we
great.
all agreeing? We're committing ourselves to no questions, just signatures. All right. Angelina has the wireless mic. She will hold the microphone. Please make sure your question is pertinent in less than 60 seconds, and we will give the congressman a chance to respond. There's a gentleman in the back, I see.
Yes, Congressman Schiff. You touched on the Democratic Party needing moderates as well as liberals. Well, I used to be a campaign operative, and I can't help but look at what's going on right now. And in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, in Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, and in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, nobody would call them moderates, but they're kicking ass right now. So, do you think that there's any say one size fits all for the Democratic Party to compete in places that traditionally are not friendly to it, or is it just a matter of the best candidate, period?
I would probably say it's a matter of the best candidate. What we have seen with some of our candidates and incumbents is Mike Levin, Katie Porter, very progressive, very conservative districts. They show how you can do that and win. At the same time, in Michigan, that might not work. I think Fetterman's running a brilliant campaign, and I was for Connor Lamb, but seeing Fetterman, I think he's the stronger choice in the general, and he is Pennsylvania, and I think he is kind of very authentically what he is, and people in Pennsylvania respect that, and I love the way he's just dishing it out to Dr. Oz. We have some really talented people on the very progressive side, some really talented people on the moderate side. I will go with the candidate every time. So I think that's been the key to the success of the folks you're mentioning, which is they're extraordinary.
Excellent. Let's see. All right. It's got to be good, Jim.
I have a short question. I'll
It's
speak
short.
in a loud voice.
No, wait for the mic.
Okay. Congressman, can you give us a little insight into the proceedings of the January 6th committee and the decision by all of you Democrats to allow Lynn Cheney to have such a large role?
Thank you for the question. Our goal of the committee is to get out the facts, get the truth before the American people, propose reforms that will help protect the country going forward. And I have to say, it has been extraordinarily refreshing to work on a committee with Democrats and Republicans, including two very conservative Republicans, but to have a single objective of getting the truth. If these hearings have looked different, it's because they are different. Because you don't see us fighting with each other. You don't see us talking over witnesses. You see no grandstanding. When our chairman, and I can't say enough about Benny Thompson, he is just fantastic. When he got COVID and couldn't preside, he handed the gavel to Liz Cheney. Let me tell you, that has never happened. You never see a chairman of one party hand the gavel, even for a moment, to someone in the other party. And that really requires trust. And, we will have our internal debates over strategy, but there's no debate over the objective. And it's ironic that, among the most highly, politicized issues, we have the least partisan investigation. I think, sadly, when we are finished with our work, you're not likely to see another committee like this again. For one very specific reason, and the credit, and I don't say this just because we're in our backyard, credit goes to the Speaker. The Speaker made a very bold decision, which in hindsight seems quite intuitive, but at the time was very controversial, not to agree to seat the people that Kevin McCarthy wanted. Had she felt that she needed to seat Jim Jordan and Jim Banks and other insurrectionists, you can imagine what a circus it would have been. No one would have come forward, and no one would have watched, because it would have been a complete circus. She has been totally vindicated in that judgment, but it's not likely to recur in the future, which is a shame, because the committee has shown just how effective Congress can be in oversight if it gets out of its own way.
Awesome. All right, everyone. As I mentioned, this book is incredible. It's a challenging read, but make sure you have your copy. If you did purchase one as part of your ticket bundle today, we are going to have the book signing just outside the door. Remember your commitment. Signature, keep it moving. Signature, keep it moving. A quick plug for Manny's. You mentioned John Fetterman and other candidates. We worked so hard this summer creating what we call our disco slate of candidates from around the country that we're excited about, and we think you should be too. There are QR codes around. Feel free to scan those so you can access them. We'll also be sharing that with you. On behalf of our team, another round of applause for Congressman Adam Schiff. And we would not be able to make any of this happen if we did not have the amazing team here. So in addition to myself, we have Angelina, our event manager, Darian, our marketing lead at the door, the team from Farming Hope that provides all the beverages and food, and each of you who are joining us today. So make sure if this is your first, it's not your last trip.